was so, and I'm gonna cheat a little bit because this information is from Laurence, but Frederick Law Olmsted was a self-taught Renaissance man, and with his two sons, they started the Olmsted Brothers landscape architecture firm. And as we'll just see tonight, it left a large imprint on the landscapes of North America. Their public parks, private estates, gardens, residential neighborhoods, entire community designs, and institutional campuses. Not only did Frederick Law Olmsted and his progeny found the field of landscape architecture, they were early proponents of urban planning. The Olmsted design philosophy addressed public health, physical and mental health, issues of equity and access that are even more relevant to contemporary park managers and users. Frederick Law Olmsted foresaw the crucial role of the experience of nature in the urban setting and the very role that parks can play for the enactment of democracy in a multi-ethnic, multi-racial society. And I would just add that I think everyone on this call would agree that parks, public spaces were incredibly important during the past years, 2 years, going on 3 years. So, and I feel very lucky, I think you all do, to have Laurence Cotton, who is an Olmsted expert and documentarian to present to us today. I hope this is okay to call you. Historian Laurence presented the PBS Frederick Law Olmsted documentary, produced it, presented it in 2014. Mr. Cotton's career spans working in the areas of conflict resolution, international affairs, and international assistance with Oxfam and Harvard-affiliated policy research institutes. He moved to Oregon and he got involved in much historic work, including the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial and the Maya Lin, how do you pronounce it? Confluence. Today, you serve as president of the Columbia Riverkeeper Board and a trustee of the Oregon State Park Foundation. And you are also a historical lecturer, including tonight. I thought we'd kick it off before we hear from Laurence. I think we all, in some form or fashion, have enjoyed Frederick Law Olmsted's parks. I'd like to do a little poll to see how many people have been to. So on a scale of 0 to 6, I'm going to name.
It's actually up on the screen, Lisa. Can everyone see the poll? I'm going to launch it right now. Can everyone see it? Okay, so if you can see the poll, you can vote how many of these landscapes are designed by Olmsted. Let's see who knows. How well do you know Frederick Law Olmsted? So we'll wait for, everybody's voting. There goes the voting. And we will, wow, we've got 50%. Oh, come on, let's see if we can get 100% participation. Let's see how well you know Frederick Law Olmsted. Let's see, we're at 80. Oh, we have, we're almost there. We're almost at 80%. Who hasn't voted yet? All right. I think some people guessed. Well, we're going to end the poll. We're going to end the poll in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds. So quick vote. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we're going to end the poll. And Lisa, can you see the results?
I can't see the results.
So. Oh, you can't see? Okay. Well, I'm going to tell you the results. So the voting was for how many of these landscapes are designed by Olmsted. One was Central Park in New York City. One was Prospect Park. One was Emerald Necklace in Boston. One was Mount Royal in Montreal, Canada. One was the grounds of the U.S. Capitol and White House in Washington, D.C. Biltmore Estate, Nashville. Well, 100% actually, 99% of you said that you knew Central Park was landscape, but the rest, you weren't so sure. 50% thought Mount Royal in Canada, 77% thought Prospect Park, 62% Emerald Necklace, Biltmore Estate, 79%. Well, the actual answer is Laurence. What's the answer?
All of the above.
All of the above. Yeah, all of the above. So we're going to learn more about all of the above. And Lisa, I thank you so much for hosting this evening. And we are going to let Laurence share the screen. And please, as I mentioned earlier, if you weren't all here, anything that you'd like to ask, please write in the little box at the bottom that says Q&A, and your questions will be answered at the end. It's a beautiful, beautiful presentation you're going to see today. And so just please in there, and I'm going to be mostly monitoring that. And if you have any issues, you can put them in the chat, but please, the Q&A is what it's here for. So we are going to get started right now. Laurence is going to share his screen and away we go.
Right. Hi, everyone. Let me just get into slideshow mode. Right. And by the way, thank you, Lisa, for that. You did a wonderful summation of my presentation. I think I should just stop speaking right now. You captured the essence of it, but it's a thank you, Debbie and Lisa. And well, I can't see all of you, obviously, but it's good to know that there are so many people interested in the name Olmsted who are with us today. It's truly an honor to present to an audience gathered from across the land by, excuse me, a little bit of paper shuffling here. Right. Truly a pleasure to have an audience gathered by the Morven Museum. And I want to extend my thanks to the staff who made this presentation possible, this virtual presentation, in particular, Debbie, obviously, Lisa today as well. And also, I think maybe Joe Murphy's working behind the scenes as a technology specialist. Though through the years, I have made a couple of brief visits to Princeton. They have been all too brief, I have to tell you. And unfortunately, I've never actually visited the Morven Museum nor walked through its gardens. So I'm certainly looking forward to doing that on the occasion when it presents. Before I go any further, indeed, this is April 26, 2022, marks the 200th birthday of Frederick Law Olmsted's birth, known as Olmsted 200. I'll be talking a little bit more about it at the end of the program, but communities across the US are readying for this spring and actually an entire calendar year of 2022 of programming to commemorate the legacy, I have to tell you, of all the Olmsteds, father, two sons, and the Olmsted Brothers architecture firm. My plan today is this. I will review Olmsted's life and career in brief, and then we will explore the Olmsted legacy across America and snippets of biographic information about the two sons too, by the way. And so we will do a visual tour across America, giving some representative examples of landscapes designed by the father, the sons, and the firm. And I will focus in on the Northeast. We will eventually get there. I will focus in on the Northeast, including, of course, New Jersey. I expect many in the audience today read author Erik Larson's historical mystery set during the time of the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago, of course, the title The Devil in the White City. Remember, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. was a secondary figure in that book, and the book does give you something of a feel for his characters. Here is a colorful description of the man as by his friend George Templeton Strong, a well-known public figure and diarist of the day. Let's enjoy a picture of Olmsted. This is George Templeton Strong speaking. He is an extraordinary fellow, talent and energy the most rare, absolute purity and disinterestedness. Prominent defects, a monomania for system and organization. He works like a dog all day and sits up nearly all night, doesn't go home to his family for 5 days together, works with steady feverish intensity till 4 in the morning, sleeps on a sofa in his clothes, and breakfasts on strong coffee and pickles. Quote unquote, George Templeton Strong. Well, you know what, folks? I expect some of you, like me, have occasionally breakfasted on strong coffee, but I'm not so sure about strong pickles at 6:30 in the morning. Well, here is Frederick himself reminiscing on his boyhood. I was very active, imaginative, impulsive, enterprising, trustful, heedless, a troublesome and mischievous boy. Later, he wrote this: "I was nominally the pupil of a topographical engineer, but really, for the most part, given over to a decently restrained vagabond life, generally pursued under the guise of an angler, a fowler, or a dabbler in the shallowest shores of the deep sea of the natural sciences." Unquote. Well, that mischievous boy turned vagabond certainly eventually made something of his life. I hope you come away from today's program with a more enhanced feel for this man and what made him tick. We're going to review some of the very parks that the poll was focused on. Central Park, Brooklyn's Prospect Park, here's Longmeadow, Boston's Emerald Necklace, the White City of Chicago World's Fair, the park systems of Buffalo, here's Delaware Park in Buffalo, Louisville, here's Cherokee Park in Louisville, legacy parks in Chicago, here's the Japanese Garden at Jackson Park in Chicago. Here is Belle Isle in Detroit. Here is Olmsted Linear Park in Druid Hills, Atlanta. The Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. In Washington, D.C., the U.S. Capitol grounds. Riverside, the green planned suburb of Riverside, Illinois. Mount Royal Park, yes, you're right, Mount Royal Park in Montreal. And the Niagara Falls State Reservation. Those are just a handful of the more celebrated, masterful landscapes designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. But if you add in the park designs and landscapes carried out by his two sons in the Olmsted Brothers firm, the imprint across the geography of North America is simply astounding. 700 public parks and 6,000 commissions. I want to share a couple of items from media coverage in the past several years. Perhaps some in our audience read this a few years ago in the New York Review of Books, an article titled "America's Green Giant" by scholar Martin Filler, including discussion of new volumes by and about Olmsted, including this one, featured here. After initially calling the author of this, Martin Filler, after initially calling claim to the acclaim that has been received by the Highline Linear Park on Manhattan's West Side, Filler writes this, quote, "Yet however much the High Line has enriched the post-millennial megalopolis, its social effects pale in comparison to the revolutionary vision of the public park as promulgated by its greatest American exponent, the 19th century polymath, Frederick Law Olmsted." Well, I expect some of you read this during the COVID winter of 1 year ago, 2021, in the pages of the New York Times, a moving essay by Michiko Kakutani, who is an avid birdwatcher, and the heading was "Finding Refuge and a Snowy Owl in Central Park." Here's a nice winter scene of Central Park. I'm quoting now from Michiko Kakutani. This is an extract of a much longer piece. "Central Park has long provided a refuge from the anxieties and stresses of daily life, perhaps never more so than during the coronavirus. New Yorkers who visited the park every day, as well as those who had long taken it for granted, felt a renewed love for this amazing rectangle of a green in the heart of the big city. Its startlingly lush woodlands and rolling lawns, its meandering trails and wide open meadows, and of course, its astonishing wildlife, including owls. Here is that very snowy owl, hawks, herons, and a dizzying array of other birds who for generations have used Central Park as a vital rest stop in their migratory travels, knowing what many humans only came to fully appreciate during the uncertainties of the pandemic, that the park is a beautiful and essential sanctuary." Michiko Kakutani. Just to give you a sense of the path that brought me to this film project when I was young, I would visit the house of my maternal grandparents very near Boston's Franklin Park. As an adult, which is at the tail end of the Emerald Necklace, by the way. As an adult, I would regularly walk along Olmsted's back bay, the fens. Here's a characteristic image on the Fenway. To visit the Museum of Fine Arts and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I would jog around the Jamaica Pond, beautiful Jamaica Pond, botanize and stroll around the Olmsted-designed Harvard Arnold Arboretum. All of those parks are integrated into Boston's famed Emerald Necklace, a crescent of Olmsted-designed parks and parkways that wind around a major portion of the city. Of course, I would also eventually visit Central Park and eventually come across a little later Prospect Park in my early 20s in Brooklyn. In fact, the first time I entered through Endale Arch, here it is here, and looked down the long expanse of the long meadow in Prospect Park, tears welled up in my eyes as I was simply overwhelmed by its sheer beauty and utter perfection. This was decades before this particular film project was a glimmer in my eye. I expect some in the virtual audience today saw our original film, Frederick Law Olmsted Designing America. It did air on PBS. Perhaps you caught the original broadcast, perhaps you managed to locate it on PBS. I did learn about 27 years ago after moving to Portland that the park system here, where I am now, Portland, Oregon, the park system here was designed, master planned by another Olmsted, Charles Olmsted, who in fact master planned all the parks of all the great cities, well, the big three cities, Portland, Seattle, and Spokane of the Pacific Northwest. And I began to say, there's something going on here, and I needed to dig down deeply. I read the existing biographies, more have been released since. I dove down into further scholarly materials. I began to chat with a few people here and there, and I approached a colleague, a friend, and associate back east in Massachusetts, Laurence Hott, and I proposed a collaboration. And I have to say it's Laurence Hott who directed and produced the film, and I served as consulting producer, and it was presented to the PBS station by WNED Buffalo in 2014. I've since continued to present the film, screen the film, but ever more so, I'm now delivering a series of presentations like this separate from the film. And during the years since, I've continued to do more and more research, to interview more scholars, to dig into the archives, to visit sites, some of which are only private, not open to the public, but to visit more and more landscapes and sites across the country and to revisit some of my favorite sites. Allow me to summarize some of the salient content of the film and to expand upon it a little and to share some of my gleanings with you. Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. was first and foremost a social reformer, and his career was central to the social reform movement of the US during the second half of the 19th century. Olmsted was a philosopher of democracy. He read widely and deeply and wrote thoughtfully about this subject, democracy, and he manifested it in his philosophy of park design and in his actual park creations. This is what Olmsted had to say about Central Park. Excuse me, we'll go back one. Here is a beautiful picture of the New York City reopening of Central Park, Sheep Meadow in spring 2021. This is Olmsted speaking about Central Park. In Central Park, you will find all classes largely represented with a common purpose, each individual adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all others, all helping to the greater happiness of each. You often see vast numbers of persons brought together, poor and rich, young and old, and he went on. Olmsted speaking. As one of our commentators, historian Keith Morgan, said in our film, quote, Olmsted intensely believed in democracy and the park as a site for the enactment of democracy. Though he strayed away from describing himself as such, he was indeed an artist. As is stated by historian Sarah Cedar Miller, Central Park was arguably the most important piece of American art in the 19th century. Clearly, it was the most monumental in scale. Author and Olmsted expert Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, the founder of the Central Park Conservancy, had this to say about Central Park in our film. Quote, it is a triumph of 19th century engineering, a symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces. I love that phrase, Elizabeth, thank you. A symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces. This is how I like to capture it. And we're going to enjoy this classic Hudson River School painting by Thomas Cole, the Oxbow on the Connecticut River in Massachusetts, very near where I attended college. And what the Hudson River School painters were doing with pigment and brush on 2 dimensions on canvas. Olmsted, and early on in collaboration with Calvert Vaux, were drawing, painting, and sculpting the landscapes of our great cities while working in 4 dimensions. What was the 4th dimension? I think many have already figured it out. Time. Let's, in Olmsted's own words, I have in all my life been considering distant effects and always sacrificing immediate success and applause to that of the future. And in laying out Central Park, we determined to think of no results of being realized in less than 40 years. Frederick Law. By the way, he really thought well beyond 40 years. There's good evidence that he thought in hundreds of years in envisioning his landscapes reaching maturity and planning into the future for the growth of America's cities. Now, I don't have time to do a deep dive into landscape history or landscape design theory today. Let me simply say that as a landscape designer, Olmsted clearly was influenced by those who came before him, practitioners of garden design, and also deep thinkers in the realm of art, such as John Ruskin. But in particular, I would like to mention Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton. He was deeply influenced by those two, and you have to give a nod. They were, of course, in England. You have to give a nod as well to Andrew Jackson Downing here in America. Andrew Jackson Downing, who was so influential in mid-19th century America. I also want to offer this shorthand. Olmsted incorporated aspects of the pastoral in the picturesque in all of his masterworks, as did his sons, by the way. And I'm going to show it to you graphically rather than explain it. Picture the contrast between the sheep meadow and the ramble in Central Park. Let's reverse that. The sheep meadow and the ramble in Central Park. It couldn't be more clear than that, the difference between the pastoral and the picturesque. And by the way, the same thing applied in Prospect Park with the Long Meadow and several of the wooded features there in Prospect Park. Well, rather than reviewing Olmsted's entire career in this program, I want to simply launch him on his career trajectory and hint at some of the stops along the curvilinear path, if you will, that caused him to become America's great park maker, his early years. As a youth, Olmsted roamed his native Connecticut countryside, initially in his father's saddle on horseback. Young Frederick attended several boarding schools in Connecticut, but he had to abandon plans for college due to weak eyesight. He briefly worked at a New York City dry goods importing firm, but the young man was captured by the romance of the sea. In 1843, he set out for China as an apprentice seaman. And thus, Fred Olmsted had his year before the mast, if you will, as a seaman sailing to China and back. In fact, it was a very harrowing experience. Olmsted did attend lectures at Yale, I will tell you, including one on the subject of scientific agriculture. Though John Hull Olmsted, his younger brother, did manage to matriculate at Yale, not Fred. However, he did spend a great deal of time in the company of other Yaleys. Now, here's a faded historic photograph. I just want to point out, if you can see my pointer here, this is John Hull Olmsted, top right. Immediately below him in the front is his brother Fred, Frederick Law Olmsted, and two Freds in the center here in the first row is Charles Loring Brace, who, by the way, would become a prominent social reformer and influenced Olmsted's ideas and his career. In 1846, Olmsted began to explore a career as a scientific farmer, a field that was on the rise. First, he apprenticed at a model farm near Syracuse, New York. That is, with his father's financial assistance, he farms initially on the Connecticut shore. And then subsequently, he buys a larger property on Staten Island, Tussumok Farm. Below, by the way, is Olmsted's original sketch of Tussumok Farm. Above is, I think, an early 20th century black and white photo. But there at Tussumok Farm, Olmsted does indeed practice scientific agriculture. He's doing a lot of experimentation, including with drainage techniques that he would perfect and utilize, by the way, in the early phase of the building of Central Park. In 1850, Frederick travels to Europe and the British Isles in the company of his brother John. And also in 1850, Olmsted is hired by the New York Times to tour the South and file reports from the field. More about those two segments of his career in a minute. In 1855, Olmsted becomes partner in the firm that publishes the I'm sorry, let's go back and just quickly, this is what the Olmsted Beale House looks like today on Staten Island. It was recently placed on the historic register. It will be restored and hopefully open to the public as a new historic park in New York City. That's the original Olmsted farmhouse through many hands over the years. Let's move ahead. So Olmsted becomes a partner in the firm that publishes Putnam's Monthly. This is an 1855 edition. That business fails in 1857, but that same year, Olmsted's first book about the South, A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States, is published. 1857 is a momentous year in Olmsted's life. He is appointed the first superintendent of Central Park, and it is after that that he and English-born Calvert Vaux collaborate on the winning design for Central Park, known famously as Greensward. And with that success, Olmsted is appointed architect-in-chief for Central Park, and this is the characteristic image we always see of him from that time in his life with his cape when he was building Central Park. In 1859, Frederick marries Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, his brother's widow. His brother died young from asthma in Europe. And Olmsted formally adopts her children, raising them as his own. In 1861, Olmsted is appointed General Secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, a Civil War-era national medical relief effort securing aid and supplies for wounded soldiers. More about that also in a minute. After resigning his appointment with the Sanitary Commission, Olmsted is appointed Commissioner of the Yosemite and Mariposa mining estates. He moves his entire family to the Sierra Nevada. They have a wonderful time out there, by the way. This is actually a larger group outing. His kids aren't here, but they were picnicking on horseback in Yosemite or Mariposa. And here is Olmsted right up front where my pointer is, second from the left on the front row, and that's Mary right next to him, Olmsted and Mary there in the Yosemite Valley area. And he manages a gold mine there in a roughneck town, and while there is appointed to a California State Commission. He plays a leadership role in writing the first report proposing the permanent protection of Yosemite Valley. More on that later. In 1865, Olmsted is reappointed landscape architect for Central Park, and with Calvert Vaux, he begins work on Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And on Broadway in Manhattan, Olmsted and Vaux opened the first office of landscape architecture practice in the US, and thus launches a unique career. Now let's review certain aspects of that career, the career of landscape designer, project manager, park builder. As builder of Central Park, Olmsted successfully managed thousands. Here's a I'm afraid it's a rather pixelated, but it's a a vintage card, color card of the construction of New York of Central Park. And Olmsted was managing thousands of men in what was truly the largest construction project to that time in America. And during the Civil War, as director of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, in essence, the forerunner of the Red Cross, Olmsted perfected his management skills while heading up a huge supply of medical relief and field hospital outfit, including a veritable armada of hospital ships. Here's a USSC hospital ship on the Mississippi. And Olmsted reorganized during this time the Army Medical Corps. He coordinated contributions and volunteers from local aid societies. In fact, the USSC at the time, by the way, the US Sanitary Commission, was at the time the nation's largest public health initiative and institution up to that point in time. Sanitary fairs were held, by the way, in the major cities of the North at the time to raise funds for the Sanitary Commission. And they were often, the women leaders of the day were deeply involved with these sanitary fairs. Here's one such woman, Catherine Prescott Wormley, who actually had a very close working relationship with Olmsted, and you can read their correspondence. And she was one of the leaders of the, and an active nurse, I have to tell you, also working in the field. Right, by the way, just one additional side note, Olmsted was right there in the aftermath of several of the bloodiest battles of the war, including Antietam. And by the way, here is a picture of a USC hospital at Gettysburg in 1863. I would argue that through all these endeavors, Central Park, the Mariposa Gold Mining Estate, the US Sanitary Commission, Olmsted was perfecting his own early version, if you will, of management science, as he was extremely effective in organizing and directing large groups of people working toward common goals. What about his early writings? Olmsted published a travelogue and a reflective series of essays in the volume Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. And it was at that point, while exploring the English countryside, that Olmsted was working out what overarching landscape design concepts he thought best to apply to American soils. And by doing so, to enhance the public park experience for everyone, not just the wealthy elite as they were up until that time. In fact, Olmsted was particularly inspired by Birkenhead Park, which was actually in Birkenhead, near Liverpool, not in Liverpool, designed by Joseph Paxton. Here's a lovely artistic rendering of Birkenhead Park. And by the way, it's clear that Olmsted was so enamored of this park that he liberally borrowed some of the design elements that he thought were so successful in Birkenhead, and he applied them in his design for Greensward and in the actual creation of Central Park. He did liberally borrow, if you would say. On another front, the literary republic, that is. Here is Olmsted as writer, editor, and publisher. His volumes about the journeys in the South and the plains, throughout the slave states, through frontier Texas, and through Kansas, had a lasting impact, and they're still in print. The later version was reissued as a single volume, The Cotton Kingdom. It's still widely available. Many different versions of this are available, and still being read today, still influential today. His career started out when he was hired by the early iteration of the New York Times, the New York Daily Times. And he was sent as a roaming correspondent in what seemed to be a foreign land, the antebellum South. And when this first book was published in England, it had a huge impact on intelligentsia, and it helped sway British public opinion away from, it was leaning towards the Confederate side, and it helps this book, the influence of his book helped sway British public opinion more towards the middle in a more neutral stance rather than leaning towards the Confederacy. And Olmsted's writings about the institution of slavery was cited by none other than Charles Darwin as influential in his thinking about race when he was preparing The Origin of Species for publication. In addition to his stint as publisher and co-editor for Putnam's Monthly, Olmsted literally co-founded The Nation magazine and played a key role as editor of that publication in its early years. During the relatively brief period in his career that he was a literary publisher, Olmsted befriended and published some of the most prominent writers and intellects of the day. Here are but a few folks. Starting, you'll recognize all of them, I dare say. Top left, clockwise, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. Some of you may or may not recognize Herman Melville and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Many other names could be added to this list, including Washington Irving, Longfellow, Henry James, for instance. You get the point between Putnam's Monthly and The Nation magazine, and through his social circle and his ties to the cultural leadership, his contacts were a veritable who's who of the arts and letters of America during this time. And to that list can be added many of the prominent social reformers of the day. Olmsted experienced considerable family tragedy, early deaths of mother, brother, and children, his own near death in a terrible carriage accident in Central Park that left him maimed for life. He also experienced a nearly lifelong struggle with depression and a host of other physical ailments toward the end of his life. Yet, even then, fighting infirmities and utter exhaustion, he was still designing the landscape for the 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Yes, and let me go back one. I forgot to mention Olmsted, in addition to his contact with all the writers of the day, he also had the contact with Frederick Edwin Church. Here's Edwin Church's famous landscape of Niagara Falls. So there's a tie-in with the Hudson River School. And here is Olmsted again later in life when he was fighting all of his infirmities and working on the final masterpieces of his life, including the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago and the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. Then he tragically lost his mind. He had to pull out of the practice, allow his sons to take over, a few years left in him, and he was growing increasingly senile and weak, and passed away in the early 20th century. What a story, what a life. One note, we did try to give some due credit to Calvert Vaux in our film, Olmsted's partner, the man who brought Olmsted into the actual design of Central Park, and who subsequently convinced Olmsted to return to the business of park building. Poor Vaux, the sometimes neglected, lesser known partner, at least to the general public at this point in time, yet a great architect in his own right, yet a man that time seems to have passed over. It's important to understand the origins of the public park movement in North America at the time. In the highly polluted cities of the 19th century, trees and shrubs and lawns and parks served famously as the lungs of the city, creating refuges of fresh air. Park advocates argued that parks provided refined imitations of nature, claiming that exposure to them would improve people's character regardless of their socioeconomic status. Architect and landscape designer Andrew Jackson Downing wrote this in 1848. He was also very thoughtful on this subject. This is what he wrote, quote, "Parks will be better preachers of temperance than temperance societies, better refiners of national manners than dancing schools, and better promoters of general good feeling than any lectures on the philosophy of happiness," unquote. Well, sentiments like that reflect the influence of the Romantics on the New World's attitudes towards nature. What had once been seen as something separate from humans, to be conquered and feared, became something humans were a part of, and that they could turn to for restoration. Downing and Olmsted brought their experience of touring European gardens to the US and further emphasizing the beneficial relationship between humans and nature and democratizing the public park experience. Before Central Park, the principal place for urban New Yorkers to walk in nature were the paths of Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And by the way, the same thing in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the famous Mount Auburn Cemetery. These large, beautiful pastoral cemetery landscapes were the equivalent of the public parks of the day. And in fact, I should emphasize that parks were absolutely seen at this point as instruments for public health. In the mid-19th century, New York and all cities were still dealing with outbreaks of cholera and other diseases. In fact, Frederick Law and Mary Olmsted lost their first child due to cholera. And though the epidemiology of such diseases was imperfectly understood at the time, indeed, Central Park did indeed serve as the lungs of the city. In their argument supporting the design for Central Park, Olmsted and his collaborator Vaux wrote this in 1868, quote, there is no doubt that the more intense intellectual activity which prevails equally in the library, the workshop, and the counting room makes tranquilizing recreation more essential to continued health and strength. Civilized men are growing more and more subject to insidious enemies to their health and happiness. And against these, the remedy cannot be found in medicine or in athletic recreations, but only in sunlight and such forms of gentle exercise as are calculated to equalize the circulation and relieve the brain, unquote. Well, it's somewhat archaic language, and you may not entirely agree with their case for passive versus active recreation. We're in a very different era now when it comes to active recreation. But as you can see, you could call them early proponents of what could be called forest bathing, a concept that in fact, the modern day version of it originated in Japan, much in vogue at this time. I have to wonder what Olmsted would think if he were with us at this moment in time, when he would see so many people wandering around in the outdoors with a soundtrack continuously beaming into their ears, or worse, not observing the natural world, but rather looking down with their eyes entranced by their shimmering screens, as this trio is here on their park bench. I would like to think they're dealing with problems at home or work, or solving the problems of the world, but you all know they are busy monitoring their social media feeds, right? Okay, enough with that. Now, our film zooms in on the stories of Central Park, Prospect Park, Buffalo, and Boston's Emerald Necklace. A few comments about those projects before I move on to other sites. By the way, both Olmsted and Vaux considered Prospect Park their masterpiece. For one, they weren't hemmed in by a rectangular area as they were at Central Park. They didn't encounter nearly the same level of political interference. Plus, they didn't need to make as many design compromises. And by the way, I showed you Endale Arch earlier. That was the pre-restoration version of Endale Arch. I'd like to show it off. It's extraordinary. Up above, until just, 2 years ago, this is what Endale Arch looked like. Go there now. This is what it looks like. And this is restored to its original, authentic appearance. Look at that. Go to the Endale Arch entrance of Prospect Park, folks, when you have a chance. It is really something. Now, it wasn't like that when I was there. Let me tell you when I first saw it. Now, what about Boston's Emerald Necklace? Let's talk about that. The Back Bay Fens. It actually predated the rest of the Emerald Necklace. This was his first project, the Back Bay Fens and the Muddy River restoration. And it was in essence a transformation of a tidal basin that was the public sewers as it flowed into the Charles River there, the estuary of the Charles River for the city of Boston. And arguably the Back Bay Fens project, 1887 Olmsted plan on the left, can be pointed to as the first true wetlands restoration project in America, I'll have you know. I could talk about many of my delightful discoveries in the making of this film. One, in fact, was Buffalo. Before beginning research on the film, I hadn't been to Buffalo since I was 6 years old. I had but a dim memory of Niagara Falls, and that was about it. But arguably, the Olmsted Park system there, here is a map of that park system. The Olmsted Park system there, you could say, is one of the best preserved and maintained of all of America. It was the first integrated park system ever built in America. More on that in a bit. And of late, there has been a great deal of acclaim given to this project there in Buffalo, which has been restored and received a great deal of attention. The Richardson Olmsted Complex, with a landscape design by Olmsted and the architecture by H.H. Richardson. It started out as the Buffalo Insane Asylum. And I should say that this was one of many collaborations between landscape architect Olmsted and architect H.H. Richardson, many collaborations in New York State and in Massachusetts. This is one of the most extraordinary in that part of New York State. Plus, nearby Buffalo, you have the Niagara Falls State Reservation designed by Olmsted and Vaux. A little background is in order here. In the 1860s at Yosemite, Olmsted had advanced the theory that a republic had the responsibility to protect scenic beauty. And in 1870s, he put theory into practice at the highly degraded industrial site of Niagara Falls. That's what Niagara Falls looked like, folks. That's what it looked like. That was what you saw there in the 19th century. And Olmsted led the campaign to preserve the waterfall complex with the Free Niagara movement. It amounted to the first big national campaign for scenic preservation. I entirely agree with the commentary in our film. Yes, sure, the falls themselves are beautiful, they're powerful, they're majestic, but go up to Goat Island, master planned by Olmsted and Vaux. This is the principal initial bridge across the waterway, the river that leads to Goat Island. Go out to Goat Island, landscaped by Olmsted and Vaux. Surround yourself with those stunning rapids. Here is the pedestrian bridge to the Three Sisters. And with the mist rising and the roar of the falls below, it is a rich visual and oral experience. Now let's talk about John Charles Olmsted, also known as John C. Olmsted, J.C. Olmsted, sequentially nephew, stepson, and business partner of Frederick Law. The young man learned his, let's give him a picture, shall we? The young man learned his father's acute skills of reading the land, understanding soils and vegetation types. He acquired his father's artistic skills as draftsman and landscape designer. He joined the firm, the family firm, in 1875 after graduating from Yale. He worked with his father on many projects, including the Back Bay Fens in Boston and the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. Then as senior engineer in the Olmsted Brothers, John led many projects for the firm, including in Essex County. Here he is at Fairstead, by the way, once he was in the family practice. And here is Branch Brook Park, the most famous of the Essex County, New Jersey parks with the cherries in bloom. I'll show more of Branch Brook in a little bit. So John C. Olmsted worked on that project as well as Atlanta, Louisville, and the Chicago park systems. He came out to the Pacific Northwest where he left a huge mark across the landscape from Idaho to Victoria, BC. John Charles Olmsted was invited out where I am here in the Pacific Northwest. The three cities, Portland, Spokane, and Seattle, basically cost-shared to bring him out here. And when he first came to the area, he was struck by the vistas, by the irregular terrain, the towering trees, bodies of water, distant views across those bodies of water, and views of magnificent snow-capped peaks seemingly hovering nearby, early 20th century black and white of Seattle with Mount Rainier barely visible hovering in the distance. He was struck by this landscape. He spent a lot of time out here visiting these three cities and working with the city fathers, if you will, city fathers and city mothers and park superintendent, park boards and park commissions. I want to point out how his appearance changed once he came out here. This is how he left Boston as a proper Bostonian, and he came to the Pacific Northwest, and look what happened. Can you believe it? That's what happens when you move from the East Coast to the West Coast. Go figure, the exact same thing happened to me in 1994. Oh, I'm being silly. Let's go on. So regarding these cities, here right in Portland, Olmsted, John C. Olmsted, designed the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. The Lewis and Clark, actually the full name is the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. He designed the grounds. And he did the same thing in Seattle with the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition of 1909, typically referred to as the AYP. Now, I do want to point out something, if you can see my cursor. Here is the centerpiece of the AYP grounds. Notice the series of fountains in the column, and what's in the distance? Of course, it's an exaggerated artistic rendering of Mount Rainier. Here's the modern day campus of the University of Washington, more commonly referred to around here as UW. Here is the Drumheller Fountain. Here is Rainier Vista. There is Mount Rainier. The centerpiece of the AYP exposition became the centerpiece of the modern day UW campus, one of the most beautiful public campuses in the Pacific Northwest, public institution. Now, Olmsted worked on some 35 different projects for Seattle, by far the greatest number of projects of any city in the Pacific Northwest, parks and parkways interlinking them. Does it look a little bit maybe like a map you saw a while ago for Buffalo? Of course it does. And here's an example of just a few of those parks. Here's a vintage postcard of Volunteer Park, perhaps the most beloved of all the Olmsted parks. Here is what it looks like today. Just gorgeous, Volunteer Park. Here is Green Lake Park. Here is Washington Park Arboretum, all in Seattle. Many more beautiful parks in Seattle. In Portland, let's see if I can get this to work correctly. Let's go back a couple, sorry about that. In Portland, near where I live, very near where I live, is perhaps the most authentic Olmsted Park in Portland. There's a longer, nuanced story here I can't take time to explain, but Laurelhurst Park is perhaps the most perfect authentic Olmsted Park in Portland, even though it wasn't individually designed by John C. Olmsted, but it was designed in the Olmsted aesthetic. Elsewhere, John C. Olmsted wrote a report, an extensive report, proposing a system of parks and policies and procedures to adhere to for the Portland Parks Board. And one of them was he proposed that this large chunk of forested land on the flanks and on the hills that hovered above the city of then downtown Portland, that it be protected in perpetuity. And now Forest Park, 5,000 acres, is one of the largest urban wilderness parks in the entire United States, still a protected preserve riddled with trails. Here is a beautiful new bridge across the creek in one of those trails, and with old growth trees, and it's a wildlife corridor, a very significant wildlife corridor. So it's really quite extraordinary, and that's what he endowed Portland with, among other things. I am not even going to take time to go into Spokane today. I do want to take you to one other site up north. There's no place like Uplands, no place like home in the Uplands. Actually, it's Oak Bay, which is a very near community to Victoria, BC. Here is the Olmsted Uplands plan. He did a full residential neighborhood there, quite an extensive community. And this is the landscape, including Oak Bay, but Uplands is right here. This is all Uplands. This is part of the park, I think, where this rocky ledge is here as well. Here is one of the parks, and that's filled with profuse camas lilies, blue camas lilies in the spring. Gorgeous site. And you'll hear more about his brother's residential enclaves in a little bit, as well as the father. I want to turn, before I talk about Junior, I am going to talk about Junior. I want to take a few minutes to talk about the City Beautiful movement and Junior's work on the at the World Columbian Exposition. Actually, it was Senior's work at the World Columbian Exposition. The elder Olmsted had further developed his ideas for planning a comprehensive series of parks, shaping the land to create spaces that seemed natural, but had in fact been highly designed to achieve a particular effect. He believed that cities could be improved through the application of principles of landscape architecture. In a democracy, Olmsted and others at the time argued the health of the republic relied on the civic health of the voting population, and that public parks in and of themselves could enhance the civic strength of the community. Planning with a comprehensive view. Here is Lake Park, Milwaukee, by the way. It's considered a beautiful example of a city beautiful park during that era. This is the beautiful staircase in Lake Park in Milwaukee. But planning with a comprehensive view was a new idea at this time in North American cities. The idea of planning, it was really a novel concept. Up until then, cities grew in a haphazard fashion. And as the 19th century progressed, the idea of guiding city development to improve living conditions and promote economic development gained currency. And what would become known as the City Beautiful movement had its roots, in fact, in the World Columbian Exposition of 1893. And the director of that World's Fair, famous impresario architect Daniel Burnham, famous for this phrase, "make no little plans," used the exposition as a show to showcase how architecture, landscape design, and planned development could create the White City, a beautiful, orderly, functional space that contrasted sharply with the many chaotic and disorderly urban areas at that time. Now, I fully realize that the White City was a temporary stage set and a folly and a utopian fantasy, but it did set something significant in motion, including what would become known as the Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C. Speaking of the Macmillan Plan, let's now turn to Senior's namesake, his son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., often referred to as Rick, the younger brother who was also brought into the family practice. He left a considerable mark across America, from Southern California to numerous sites, to Florida, to numerous sites in Washington, D.C. Junior was born on Staten Island, the son of Frederick Law Olmsted and Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, the widow of Olmsted's brother. And from his earliest years, the young Olmsted, let's give you a picture of the young Olmsted. Where did he go? Sorry, folks. There he is, the young Olmsted, Rick Olmsted. From his earliest years, he was aware of his father's fervent desire to have him carry on both the family name and profession. And from early on, the father insisted that the son became far educated, better educated than was the father in botany and horticulture, as the father felt inadequate in those areas. In the waning years of his life, the father included his young son in the culminating projects of his own career, while still a student at Harvard, in fact. The young Olmsted spent a summer working in Daniel Burnham's office as the Forgive me, my clicker isn't always cooperating. He worked in Daniel Burnham's office as the World Columbian Exposition was rising in Chicago. And after graduating in 1894, Rick spent a year on site at Biltmore, the 100,000-acre estate being developed for George Vanderbilt Jr. there in Asheville, North Carolina. Following his father's retirement, he eventually became a full partner at this very place. This is their home in Brookline, Massachusetts, now the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site called Fairstead, named by Olmsted, in fact. And it not only was the family home, it was the site of the family business. Both sons, by the way, Junior and his elder brother, Charles, played key roles in founding the ASLA, the American Society of Landscape Architecture. And Junior also helped establish and taught at the first professional landscape architecture program in America, of course, at Harvard. Olmsted Jr. emerged on the national scene in 1901 when he was appointed to the Macmillan Commission. Here he is at Fairstead as a practicing adult in the family practice, and he was appointed to the Macmillan Commission in Washington, D.C. that produced the famous Macmillan Plan, charged with interpreting for the 20th century Pierre Charles L'Enfant's vision of the nation's capital. Olmsted worked with his father's colleagues from the Chicago World's Fair to transform Washington into a work of civic art and to devise a comprehensive plan for its future development. A partial listing of Junior's projects in the nation's capital reads like a guide to Washington, D.C., including the National Mall, the Jefferson Memorial, Roosevelt Island, the National Cathedral Grounds, the National Zoo. Come on, National Zoo, show up. There you are, the National Zoo, the White House grounds, here indicated as the Executive Mansion, and Rock Creek Park. I have to show you two pictures here of gorgeous bridges in one of my favorite parks, certainly in Washington, D.C., marvelous Rock Creek Park and the Parkway. And by the way, speaking of the nation's capital, I do want to remind you that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. also left his mark there. Sr. did extensive landscaping work on the U.S. Capitol grounds, including reorienting the entrance and designing and seeing to the installation of the Capitol steps. The Capitol steps, I want to repeat that, the Capitol steps, folks. Remember, Olmsted Sr. saw all his public commissions as public spaces where Americans would enact democracy. In August 2015, the National Park Service hosted a special event commemorating the 150th anniversary of Olmsted's historic report that you see before you, Yosemite and the Mariposa Grove of Big Trees. This report is largely credited with providing the basis for the creation of Yosemite National Park subsequently, and the report's thoughtful wording is considered by many to be the first step in the establishment of our national park system. That was Olmsted Sr. You might remember that the National Park Service celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2016. In fact, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the son, played a key role in writing the legislation, the wording of the Organic Act, the legislation in 1916 that founded the National Park Service, like father, like son. For 30 years, Rick advised the National Park Service on issues of management and conservation of scenic resources. He left a significant mark on the national parks from coast to coast, including, but not limited to, Acadia National Park in Maine, Everglades National Park, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and Yosemite National Park. Very key role in the national park system, Junior. Let's swing back to the East Coast quickly. And to look at some residential communities by all of the Olmsteds, in fact, father and younger son. Designing residential developments, enclaves, neighborhoods were something of a specialty of the Olmsteds, father and sons. The early residential development, of course, was Riverside in Illinois, designed by Sr., master planned by Sr., established in 1869, and boasts of being one of the first planned communities in America. Has several unique and defining features, including curvilinear streets, ample setbacks for all the homes, pastoral parkways with open lawn and naturalistic groupings of trees interspersed throughout the village. This is the centerpiece park in the village of Riverside, Illinois. 3 of Junior's residential developments, I'm just going to flash by you quickly. Moving north to south, Forest Hills in Queens, Roland Park in Baltimore, and Mountain Lake in Lake Wales, Florida. Here it's indicated as Mountain Lake Estates Historic District, Lake Wales. And by the way, that is adjacent to Clock Tower Gardens, Junior's Botanical Gardens masterpiece in Lake Wales, Florida. Where is Lake Wales, you're asking? It's in the central highlands of Florida, about an hour south of Orlando. Highly recommend visiting. Let's take a quick tour, you're waiting for this, of the Olmsted landscapes in the region where most of you are gathered today. I'm going to start way, however, in upstate New York and end in Philadelphia. I do want to point out, I'm going to avoid New England, but I do want to point out that the Olmsted footprint in New England is extraordinarily extensive, especially in southern New England, including quite a few parks in the suburbs of Connecticut, not far from New York City. But let's focus on New York and New Jersey, shall we? And we'll end in Philadelphia. Here's Buffalo Park System, the first integrated park system ever designed in America, Olmsted in box. Here are but a couple of the parks. It's extensive. Delaware Park and Front Park. And Martin Luther, formerly first named Humboldt Park, now Martin Luther King Park, renamed. And here are kids so enjoying the fountain and splash pad on a hot summer day. By the way, many other parks were subsequently added to the system during the Olmsted era, as were parkways. Here is an historic image of the Lincoln Parkway on the left on horseback, and a modern day image of Bidwell Parkway on the right. Still there, Bidwell is still there in Buffalo. Not far from Buffalo is Rochester, which has an entire Olmsted portfolio of parks. I'm showing you but one, perhaps the most well-known, Highland Park. Here is the state capital in Albany, folks. Guess what? Olmsted. Landscape Olmsted and building H.H. Richardson, another collaboration. And there you are, the state capital of New York. How about Newburgh Park in Downing Park in Newburgh? I've got to get it straight. And of course, this is named after the famous landscape architect who was so influential in Olmsted's early years. And Olmsted and Box together designed this park to honor their pal Downing. In fact, it was Downing who introduced Box to Olmsted. And let's go to New York City, shall we? There's an embarrassment of riches in New York City. I'm going to show you but a few, folks. There's so many. You all know the famous parks. We already have talked about them, Central and Prospect. Here's Union Square. Morningside Park on the upper west side on the Hudson River. Same thing with Riverside Park, of course, Hudson River. And the same thing with Fort Tryon State Park, Hudson River. But this is Junior, I have to say. This is Olmsted Jr. There's one of the characteristic ramparts, the forsythia in bloom here. And I have to show you this. It's a new element just added in recent years, but it's gorgeous, the Heather Garden. Go to Fort Tryon State Park, wander the entire landscape, the original Olmsted landscape, see the new Heather Garden there. How about Fort Greene Park in Brooklyn? And how about the New York Botanical Gardens? Vox was originally involved with landscaping, certain aspects of the landscaping of the New York Botanical Gardens. Olmsted Jr. and the Olmsted Brothers firm came on a little later in the 20th century to do additional master planning for the New York Botanical Gardens. Let's go out to Long Island, shall we? Here's the Bayard cutting, I believe it's pronounced Bayard cutting Arboretum on the south shore of Long Island, halfway out. Here is and by the way, Olmsted Sr. is responsible for the landscape at Bayard Cutting Arboretum, which I have to tell you is a state historical park. It's open to the public. Here is the Manor House. Here is the Woodland Garden. Recent work has more new landscaping has gone here into the Woodland Garden. And there's a gorgeous lake there, views on a gorgeous lake, just lovely. Bayard Cutting Arboretum, South Shore, Long Island. North Shore, you have the Planting Fields Arboretum, also a state park open to the public. Here's Coe Hall. This is Junior, by the way. This is Olmsted Brothers. Coe Hall, the Italian garden and pool there at Planting Fields. And here is a perfect Olmstedian vista, an Olmstedian vista at Planting Fields. Let's continue. We're finished with New York for the time being. Let's go on to New Jersey. The Olmsted Brothers were brought in to master plan an entire county park system for Essex County, New Jersey. Here is famous Branch Brook Park, once again with the flowers in bloom. Here is a gorgeous picture. I love this picture with the fountain and the lion here. Also Branch Brook Park and the Parkway. Here's Wequahic Park. I hope I'm pronouncing it correct. I don't know Wequahic too well, but it's right there in Newark, Wequahic Park. And they master planned the South Mountain Reservation. This is the Olmsted Brothers' actual master plan. It's an extraordinarily fine detailed plan. I think you can actually read almost the finest print here. for the South Mountain Reservation, 1902. Again, part of the Essex County Park System. Here is Anderson Park in Montclair, which has an active friends group, which is totally loving this park. All of these parks have active friends groups, I have to tell you, and conservancies that take good care of them to one degree or another. Here is Warrenoko Park in Roselle. By the way, these are all Olmsted Brothers, not Olmsted Sr. And let's get to something that's very near Princeton, the Lawrenceville School. I'm afraid this, it's hard to find aerials that are perfectly crisp when you blow them up to slide level, but this is an aerial of the Lawrenceville School campus in Lawrence Township, just a stone's throw from Princeton. Olmsted Sr., by the way, this is Olmsted Sr. And together they did work on numerous academic campuses across America, collectively, I should say, colleges, universities, and private schools across America. But unquestionably, one of the most distinctive is the campus landscape designed for the Lawrenceville School. In 1880, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. created a campus master plan that was designed to foster a vibrant academic community. Here's some of the older buildings, by the way, on campus. He created a master plan that was designed to foster a vibrant academic community. He drew from the English campus system with buildings arranged around a central green. And one could say that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. took it up a notch here by creating a living museum of botany and dendrology for the students, with 371 species of trees planted throughout the landscape. Now, I should mention that although Olmsted designed the landscape, it was the architectural firm of Peabody and Stearns that master planned the original buildings, and I believe including the two that you see here, certainly the one in the rear, which is the father's building. Later in the 20th century, the Olmsted Brothers served as consulting landscape architects on this very same campus. And since that time, the core historic campus received the designation of National Historic Landmark District. I have not set foot on campus at Lawrenceville. I do hope to have a chance to wander and explore the Lawrenceville campus someday before long. Last but not least, we travel in New Jersey, we travel to Trenton, where sits the only public park in New Jersey actually completely designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., Cadwell Air Park. Oops, I'm sorry. One more scene of Lawrenceville School campus buildings. That's a more modern building up top. I enjoy this architecture. Let's go to Cadwell Air Park. That's a controversial new sign at the entrance to Cadwell Air Park. I was just reading about it on the left. I gather there's been some controversy attached to it. And well, it's not so much the sign, but it's a gate that I think is in that same location that opens and closes and occasionally prevents cars from entering the park. I cannot get into that controversy. I don't know enough about it, but it's clear that the locals love this park. And look at this beautiful. I love interpretive signs, detailed. The more detailed, the better. What a wonderful interpretive sign that is about Cadwell Air Park and the Olmsted design philosophy behind it and all the design elements. Congratulations to friends at Cadwell for doing that. And there in Cadwell Air Park, which is the oldest park in the city of Trenton, here is the Ellerslie Mansion, which is the Trenton City Museum. Perhaps some of you have been there to the Trenton City Museum, formerly the Ellerslie Mansion. I hope I'm pronouncing it correct for the folks in Trenton. And also there, oops, we missed one, I think. Well, I seem to have missed a slide. Maybe it's out of order, I apologize. Well, there in that park, Cadwell Park, also is the canal, the Delaware and Raritan Canal. I'm sure all of you locals know this, which flows through the edge of the park, and there's a trail along the canal that crosses a bridge. It might be out of place in my collection here. But that's the one principal Olmsted Sr. park site in all of New Jersey. All the others are Olmsted Brothers. Sr. did the landscape for Lawrenceville School, but that's a private institution, obviously not a public park. Let's move to Philadelphia. Now, every now and again, people say to me, they posit to me, oh, Fairmount Park in Philadelphia was designed by Olmsted. No, it wasn't. It predated Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. There is some evidence that he was inspired by Fairmount Park. He liked it. I think he was inspired and influenced by it, but Olmsted Sr. had nothing to do with Fairmount Park. The only significant public park of note in Philadelphia that has an Olmsted imprimatur is League Island Park. You don't know it as League Island, you know it as FDR Park. It started out as League Island Park when the Olmsted brothers were involved, up above, top picture. And now it is FDR Park in South Philly. And that's the one large, extensive park in Philadelphia, which has a Olmsted branding, if you will. Now, there's a new, to me, a new location I've just learned about because it's received some attention in the media. Also, an Olmsted Brothers garden design. It's the Krisheim estate in the Chestnut Hill neighborhood of Philadelphia. It's received some media attention of late. And if I'm not mistaken, the Chestnut Hill Conservancy occasionally offers public tours. I'm not sure if you're allowed to go in the home, but I think they occasionally offer public tours of the grounds of the Krisheim estate, but it's a privately owned home, unless I'm mistaken, not open to the public, but it does have an Olmsted Brothers designed garden. Now, if I had more time, folks, if I had more time, I would take you to Wilmington, Delaware, where there are more Olmsted parks. I would take you to Baltimore, where there are yet more profusion of Olmsted parks and residential enclaves, not just Roland Park that I pointed out earlier. Then you already heard about DC, but so it's a rich, your area where many of you are chiming in from is rich with Olmsted landscape designs if you take in, again, the father and the two sons in the Olmsted Brothers firm. And if I had more time, I would spend time in California. We don't have time, I realize. And if I were doing this out west, I would have not talked a whole lot about New Jersey, and I would have talked a whole lot more about California. Now, I can't take time to talk about the brothers who did have, and Junior, who had extensive influence in California, but let me show you two of Olmsted Sr.'s principal projects. Yes, he was active in California too. Remember, he was out here already at Yosemite. He was introduced to the city fathers of San Francisco and to the political leaders of the state. Here is Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, Olmsted Sr. And if we can get the slides to cooperate, oops. It's the Stanford University campus, a controversial and tense working relationship between client Leland Stanford and designer and architect Frederick Law Olmsted. Often the big ego Leland Stanford won out when it came to these disputes. After all, he was paying the bills. It was his campus in his name to commemorate his son. But still to this day, it is considered a masterful academic campus design. And still to this day, many of the Olmsted recommended sightlines and orientations apply. And I gather that as the Stanford continues to build out its campus, make changes to its landscape, improve the orientation of its roadways and paths, and build new buildings, they're trying ever more so to adhere to the original Olmsted master plan and recommendations. Now I'm going to bring this to a close. Folks, during the past couple of years of the COVID quarantine and social distancing, public parks have been a lifesaver for so many of us seeking fresh air, exercise, physical and psychological health, and in doing so safely. Frederick Law Olmsted now appears to be so entirely prescient. As for one, he emphasized the public health, mental health, and taking it further, even the spiritual health benefits of the park experience for everyone in a democracy. Though Olmsted did not utilize terms so common in our vocabulary today, terms such as equity and access. However, if one reads his writings, you could argue that he cared deeply about all those issues. So as we commemorate Olmsted Sr.'s birthday and the Olmsted landscape legacy during 2022, we also highlight the ever more crucial role that the public park experience plays in all of our lives. Needless to say, COVID and social and environmental justice movements have only greatly underlined that very fact, and the urgent need to provide more green space and to distribute it equitably and make all such spaces accessible and inviting to all. In fact, it isn't too much of a stretch to say that that was Frederick Law Olmsted's agenda from the start. I do pray for all of our sakes that within a year, that we will have this pandemic episode behind us in our rearview mirrors. If not before then in 2023, we will all feel more comfortable traveling freely about this beautiful land. I urge you to revisit cities that you've not been to in a long time, perhaps you've never seen before. Go to parts of America you've never seen before, including cities that have been in the news for not such good reasons, for not such positive reasons because of tragic events that have happened there. And also some of our famous Rust Belt, so-called Rust Belt cities. Revisit Louisville. Here's Cherokee Park in Louisville. Detroit, go to Belle Isle in Detroit, my goodness. And in Buffalo, Take a side trip to Goat Island above Niagara Falls and see the waterfall complex again with fresh eyes. I want you to leave you with these thoughts. Here's what landscape architect Faye Harwell had to say upon reflecting about her childhood experience in Central Park. Quoting Faye, "Sometimes we don't even know that we've been experiencing an Olmsted Park. And if you think of those tiny little experiences multiplied over all those thousands of parks, this is really a huge, huge impact on human experience in America." Perhaps we will let Daniel Burnham, the driving force of the World's Columbian Exposition, to close out this program. When the World's Fair was set to open in 1893, at a dinner with all the artists and architects gathered to laud Burnham for his achievements, Burnham himself pivoted and said this about his collaborator, Olmsted. And here is the famous John Singer Sargent portrait of Frederick Law Olmsted at Biltmore. This is what Burnham had to say. "Each of you knows the name and genius of him who stands first in the heart and confidence of American artists, the creator of your own parks. Frederick Law Olmsted, an artist, he paints with lakes and wooded slopes, with lawns and banks and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views. He should stand where I do tonight, not for the deeds of later years alone, but for what his brain hath wrought, and his pen has taught for half a century." Daniel Burnham. Finally, in Olmsted's own words, folks, "The beauty of the park should be the beauty of the fields, the meadow, the prairie, of the green pastures and the still waters. What we want to gain is tranquility and rest to the mind. Is it doubtful that it does men to good to come together this way, in pure air and under the light of heaven?" Frederick Law Olmsted. Seems to me that that prescription, if you will, rings as loud today in 2022 as it did in the late 19th century. Thank you, Frederick Law Olmsted and Sons. Thanks to all of you for your time and attention today. Thanks to the Morven Museum for hosting me for this program today. I'm going to share some information with you as we close out. Books, you're all going to want to know. What books? I recommend these. Genius of Place by Justin Martin. A Clearing in the Distance by Witold Rybczynski. The masterwork of a master genius, Dean of Olmsted Scholars, Charles Beveridge, Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing the American Landscape, just reissued by Rizzoli Press. Marvelous coffee table book. I cannot more highly recommend it. A new biography of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., the first ever published, titled Beauty, Efficiency, and Economy by Elizabeth Hope Cushing. Just published this fall. The Power of Scenery, Frederick Law Olmsted and the Origin of National Parks by Dennis Drabell. And literally just published this week, literally 2 days ago, Architects of an American Landscape by Hugh Howard. It's endless. There's many more books forthcoming this year, folks. Here is Olmsted 200. Those of you with cameras ready, take your screenshots. If you want to stay in touch with Olmsted 200, here's how you do it with the website, olmsted200.org. There's all your social media feeds. And if you haven't seen our film, if you go to the PBS main website, all you can do is see the film. If you go to this website, it's a long URL. If you go to this website, not only can you see the film, there are many additional videos and a great deal of scholarly essays contributed by scholars and advisors to the project about Olmsted's life, career, and legacy. And some of you might want to take a screenshot of that. Lastly, here are some, not all, of my sources and your resources. Take a screenshot of that. And in addition to all those organizations, the National Association for Olmsted Parks, Olmsted Online, Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site, which is National Park Service, the National Archives, the Cultural Landscape Foundation, and just about every major Olmsted park has a conservancy, well-funded or a more modestly funded friends group, doing a marvelous work as volunteers, restoring the parks, maintaining the parks, educating about the parks, and some of them maintain wonderfully rich websites, even with limited resources. Always go to a park conservancy or friends group website. And that's my contact information. Thanks very much, folks. Thanks for bearing with me this afternoon. I had some sticky slides, and this has been known to happen. I've never yet found a way to offer a PowerPoint on Zoom without a sticky slide scenario, but thanks for bearing with me.
Thank you so very much, Laurence. This was really, really wonderful. And I know a lot of people want to have their questions answered. So we have a couple of questions here that we want to go into. And I also want to let everyone know that we will be sending you a couple of things following this program. You'll be getting a survey. You'll be also getting the list of resources that Laurence shared with us. So if you didn't get the screenshot, don't worry. We will have that information for you. And let me just quickly go through a couple of questions here because we don't want to not answer these. So Patricia asks, to create Central Park, a thriving African-American community, Seneca Village, was destroyed in the process. Was there any objection, reluctance on Olmsted's part, knowing his strong anti-slavery views?
Good question, and it's coming up often these days, not surprising. And by the way, there's an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York right now. The Central Park Conservancy has a great deal of information up about this, no bones, if you will. That's a bad pun, I apologize. But no, a very straightforward, honest, frank discussion of that is on the Central Park Conservancy website. And there's a brand new book in research going to be released on Olmsted's birthday in April by Sarah Cedar Miller, who is the reigning historian of Central Park. The title of the book is Before Central Park. I've read some advanced research she's done. She literally has combed through all the real estate records, all of the home ownership records, all of the voting polls. And here's the deal. Olmsted, first of all, there's no excuse for what happened in Seneca Village, no excuse. A historic, long residential African-American community, but by the way, not just African-American, German immigrants and Irish, predominantly African-American community in Central Park was before Olmsted arrived on the scene. Before Olmsted arrived on the scene, the absentee landowners were paid market value. Mostly, by the way, many of them were absentee and then they were renting. And you had to actually be a landowner in order to qualify to be on the, if you were Black, to qualify to anyone needed to be a landowner. No, I specifically African Americans, I think, had to have own land to qualify to actually vote in New York City at the time. I apologize, it was specifically African American. At any rate, it's a long and challenging issue to address. But the point is, by the time Olmsted arrived on the scene in 1857, they were all empty. All the owners had already been paid. It was eminent domain. It was owned by the city of New York. And the city of New York, there was maybe some wheeling and dealing with the city of New York. However, Sarah Cedar Miller's research indicates the majority of the owners were paid then market value for those residences. But it was eminent domain, and they were asked and forced to leave their property. And that's very unfortunate, and it shouldn't have happened. By the time Olmsted arrived on the scene, they were empty. They were just a bunch of empty buildings. And he proceeded to do what he was told to do to clear the land for the building of Central Park. We don't know to this day. There's no evidence that he had an objection to this. There's no evidence that that it conflicted with his values. It doesn't show up in any literature, not that I'm aware of. But he himself was not involved in the evictions, nor in clearing out the human beings who were resident there. He was involved in the clearance of empty structures that were there on that site by the time he was hired to build Central Park. So that's as best I can do in shorthand to give an answer to that. Much more will be revealed when Sarah Cedar Miller's book is published. I wish it were published now, or I wish it were widely available now, but it won't be coming out until the book.
Thank you, Laurence. So we have one other question. Could you talk a bit about Shelburne Farm in Vermont? A wealthy resident of Princeton modeled his estate on it, and it is now one of our most interesting neighborhoods.
Interesting. Well, I didn't know that with the Princeton connection, but Shelburne Farms was master planned by the Olmsted Brothers. They master planned the Shelburne Farms estate. I actually have been there, although it's been ages, but they did master plan the Shelburne Farms estate. And to be honest, I haven't done research about Shelburne Farms forever. So I'm actually forgetting some of the details, but it is an absolutely beautiful place just south of Burlington. It's a gorgeous estate. It's open to it's a private resort hotel complex, but it's a quasi-public park. It is open to the public during limited hours. But the landscape is very Olmstedian. I wish I could show you pictures right now. It's perfectly Olmstedian landscape. That's the driveway in, the trails, the mixture of hill and dale and rolling terrain and clusters of trees and a protected wild area and views to the lake and so forth. And it's characteristically Olmstedian. That's about all I can tell you about it, though. I don't know anything about this Princeton connection.
Thank
I
you,
apologize.
Lawrence. And so since we're running so late, I'm just going to do one last final question. Was Verona Park in New Jersey designed by Olmsted?
Where is Verona Park? I don't even know.
This was a question by someone, Carol Zinn, Verona Park.
Okay.
It's not familiar to you.
No, it may be. It may be one of those one of the more obscure Olmsted Brothers parks. There are others. I didn't cover all of them, by the way. I did a broad brush stroke, so that may be one that I'm just not familiar with.
Well, thank you so much. It was just wonderful. There's a lot of compliments in the chat. There will be a recording of this, so there was so much to absorb, so you can enjoy going through it. We will be sending everyone who signed up for tonight's program a recording. We'll be sending you the resources that were at the end of the recording, and we so appreciate everything, Laurence. It was just really wonderful, and thank you all. Thank you, Lisa, for hosting, and go visit a park, everyone. Thanks so much, everyone. Good night.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure, everyone, visiting with all of you, and thank you, Debbie and Lisa, for hosting today. I hope to visit all of you in New Jersey. I'll visit at the Morven Museum, and I'll visit in the Lawrenceville campus, and we'll learn more and we'll visit more. Thank you all.
Good night.
All right.